Welcome to On the Money, where the business of Russia is business. I'm Peter Lavelle. To date, 2014 has been a slow year for the economy, and consensus growth projections remain modest. While far from a gloomy picture, the government has its work cut out for it to return the economy to dynamic expansion. Will it succeed? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Timothy Kraus. He is the head of the Russia Bank Opportunity Fund at IFC Asset Management Company. We also have Simon Fentham-Fletcher. He is the portfolio manager at Renaissance Asset Managers. And we have Yaroslav Lisovolek. He is the chief economist at Deutsche Bank, Russia. Yaroslav, I'll start off with you. They had hoped January would have been a better month. What kind of picture do you see unfolding for the first quarter?
Well, I think certainly January was quite weak, and the main culprit was fixed investment. So the investment side continues to be the weakest link in Russia's growth performance. But there is hope that in February we might have some recovery, especially on the consumption front, because we have the Olympics, and according to various estimates, the contribution from the Olympics for Russia's GDP could be as high as 0.3 to 0.4 percentage points for the year as a whole. So on a monthly basis, it could be even more emphatic. So for the quarter as a whole, it will be a difficult period, but there are some rays of hope and some triggers that may make Russia look a bit better than in January.
Okay. Tim, would you agree with that?
I might look just beyond the first quarter just a little bit, because I think where Russia is today, they need to think about dealing with some of the structural problems in the economy, effectively getting away from the oil and gas and the commodity reliance that they have, which has been a theme now for quite some time. But we're coming to the end of this sort of decade when we could rely on those revenues, and we need to diversify into different industries. I think if we don't do that, Russia risks being stuck around 2% GDP for an extended period of time.
And that's something that this economy hasn't been used to for a long time.
Absolutely.
Simon, this is really the big change here, is that it's not that there's a slow growth, that is it compared to the decade preceding, this is extremely slow growth now.
Yeah, I mean, 2%. 2% feels like recession. 1.3% last year, and it hurt. You know, Russia has been used to 5, 6, 7% growth in certain years. So the significant slowdown is relatively speaking, is feeling like a recession, even though it's not. Let's not forget that we are still seeing significant some growth, specifically within the consumer sector. The consumer sector last year was the thing that drove Russia GDP growth. As we already heard, you know, fixed income or capital expenditure was down on the year, and that we're hoping that will pick up. But a problem looking forward into the future is potential slowdown of the consumer.
And this has always been the golden egg, at least particularly in the last 5 or 6, 7 years.
Absolutely. The consumer was the main force in Russia's economic growth. Partly it was due to the budget financing, which consistently supported especially the lower strata of the population and the middle class. And of course, external conditions were relatively favorable as well, with high oil prices, and that was a key factor supporting the consumer. Now, more recently, in the past several years, we've seen a significant growth in lending and consumer lending that started to become a major factor, even to such a degree that it became a concern for the central bank, for the monetary authorities, because it was actually too fast. So too much of a good thing.
Picking up a bad Western habit here, I would say.
To some degree.
No, I totally agree. I mean, this, I think, peaked last summer. It's now coming down a little bit, but if you look at the level of debt that the average Russian consumer has, consumer debt, it's really at a level that is very comparable with Eastern European countries. It can't go much higher right now. And beyond that, it's not secured debt. It's not mortgages. It's not cars. It's basically cash loans that have been used for consumption. So this worries me a little bit. Even though the consumer is still the major driver of the economy, I am not confident that this can continue for a long time.
Yeah, we've seen NPLs across all banks rising significantly. And if you go outside of Russia, I believe it's about 40% of net disposable income is spent on interest and capital repayments, which is...
That's amazing.
It's just,
That's
it's
amazing.
an
Considering, I would say even before 2008, personal debt was something that was hardly talked about at all in this country.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that the banks, obviously the CBR has stepped in and with a new leader has increased supervision across a large number of Russian banks, and we're seeing the proliferation of 900 Russian banks being shrinking down, which is a good thing. We want strong, sustainable banking sector that isn't pushing out loan growth at 20, 30, 40% per year. That's unsustainable.
We're all talking about, since the middle of last year, but this is when the government shifted gears, okay, because there was an expansionary policy, and then what I call Russian austerity came in. But there was a plan behind that, is that it would slow down the economy, though in the second quarter, third quarter of this year, we would see the fruition, the fruits of that plan. Is it still on track?
Yeah, I think the understanding is that quality matters probably even more in the near term than the
explain to our viewers what that means, because
the quality of growth. The growth that we want is through productivity. We want growth through greater efficiency rather than just through high oil prices. And partly because of that, I think there is a certain rethink in terms of the economic strategy, whereby the government is looking into budget spending, looking into the possibility of cutting back some of the things there that prove to be inefficient. There seems to be a measure on the part of the government to try and evaluate the efficiency of various parts of government spending.
This is something new for this economy, Tim. Because I haven't heard this kind of talk before. We've all talked about diversification, and we've been talking about that for a decade. But this kind of quality growth issue, productivity, this is something that's new on the agenda.
No, I think this is the diversification of economic growth. This is what you're talking about. And the question is, how do you actually get it to happen? It's not a simple question. And in my view, the key is for private sector entrepreneurials to unlock the regulations, to unlock the bureaucracy that holds them up from starting businesses. And there's many things like that. So if Russia can do that, I think the seeds for better distribution of growth amongst the economy is there. And that would make the country so much less volatile going down the road. No dependence on the commodity cycle, or much less than we see today.
Simon, is this, we're looking at kind of a threshold here, a turning point here, and I think, what Tim just said is very, very interesting, because it's now moving away from state companies, because the state protects the state companies, and there's been so much focus on that, so much money thrown at it as well here, but it hasn't addressed the productivity issues, and from what Tim just said here, now we have to look at the private sector more.
Yeah, I completely agree. The problem is, we're not getting the growth in entrepreneurial young Russian businesses, where there are fewer startups now than there were a few years ago, whether it's because of bureaucracy, whether it's because of the collapse in the ruble. There are many factors, but it is something that needs to be addressed, and not just from diktat from above. It needs to be a groundswell of Russians wanting to push forward, whether they've stopped doing it because of structural reform or because of many other fears that they may have. It's something that, for the future of Russia, the dam needs to break, and there needs to be a mass of young 20s, young 30s pushing forward and starting their own businesses. The number of SMEs is significantly lower than it needs to be.
So does the government get it from what we just heard?
Yes, and it seems like the government is starting to look into the possibility of compiling a new reform program precisely along the lines of a structural effort directed at boosting productivity. Finally, the focus is more short-term. Previous programs, reform programs, were for 10, 15, 20 years. Now the focus is on the next several years. So hopefully that kind of effort will lead to something akin to what we saw in 2000, 2001 during Putin's first term, the most successful reform program that we've had in decades, the GREF program. If something like that is rolled out later this year, I think this is one of the potential drivers for the economy and for the markets this year.
Tim, they don't have much choice, do they? I mean, we have a government that has been able to garner support because the economy has been relatively successful. And we've all remember the 1990s, and we remember the early 2000s. Now, again, this kind of turning point here. It's not that if they want to do it, they have to do these things.
Well, I hope they see it that way, Peter, but I'm not sure yet. Let's see. There are a couple other tools, I think, that are out there that could really help this economy. The first is more investment in infrastructure, which is something that Mr. Putin talked about a year ago. It's easier said than done, but it's terribly needed in this country, and it would really
but that's a difference
support
between what
industry.
Yaroslav was saying. You know, the short term. There's in many ways they have to start thinking more short term, and infrastructure. That's a big,
It's a big one,
long-term
but we shouldn't
issue.
forget some of the medium, long-term ones. The other thing is building institutions that will support private businesses, like financial markets. I think the work that's been done in, rebuilding the stock exchange here, improving the registry system, all of these sort of technical things which most of us don't spend time thinking about. That's how you get to have institutional investors that start to bring money into Russia. And that's how you get Russian companies that start to be able to raise money in Russia. So these things shouldn't be forgotten either. I think there has to be a balance.
And they're very doable, Simon.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the custody thing is significant. Obviously, Euro-clearable securities, it makes a big difference. There's not, local shares and GDRs as we had previously. And this is something that, we do want institutional money. We don't want. Traditionally, the Russian stock market has been very flighty. Often a lot of hot money flowing in and out whenever you wanted a high beta.
Yeah.
For Russia to have sustainable long-term growth, it needs the substantial institutional money from overseas to be flowing inside, and those little changes do make a big difference.
Yaroslav, before we go to the break, you want to comment on that?
Yes, I think this is precisely the issue for Russia's stock market. It's been underperforming throughout the past several years, and again, the issue there is quality. We need quality investors. We need long-term investors. Some of the reforms that were conducted, they certainly were very important. We need more.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Russia's economy. Stay with RT. Welcome back to On the Money, where the business of Russia is business. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about Russia's economy. Yaroslav, everybody coming into this program, my staff, my friends, my landlord, my cleaning lady, they all want to know one thing. What's going on with the ruble?
Well, the thing with the ruble is that it's very interesting that starting from last year, it started to track emerging market currencies, such as the Turkish lira, the Brazilian currency, the South African currency. So it's essentially now within this vortex of the EM currency crisis. And, to some degree, you look at it from within Russia, you think, why is Russia within that vortex? Because really, you look at Russia's sovereign balance sheet, it's much stronger than a lot of these emerging markets. Russia has a current account surplus. The level of oil prices is relatively comfortable. So to some degree, this is certainly, I think, to a large extent, an external factor that is impacting Russia again, and something that, again, underscores the significant dependency of Russia on external factors.
So I would just add two things. I think, one, we can't forget what's going on in the United States with tapering, which has really been the catalyst for almost all of the problems in the emerging market currencies. And Russia has not been as affected as much as some countries like Turkey, Argentina, in 3 days.
Oh, they're furious.
16% down. I mean, it was an absolute disaster. I think Russia, like you said, because of its reserves and its approach to the currency is a little more isolated and insulated than these other countries. So I think the other factor here is that the central bank is no longer targeting the value of the currency per se. They're looking at inflation, they're looking at domestic interest rates, and so you can't have both. And so right now the trade-off seems to be we'll tolerate a little more weakness in the ruble as long as we can continue to stimulate growth domestically. That's the trade-off.
Is that a good mixture there?
Yeah, I mean, I would also add that, obviously, depreciating ruble is not great for inflation. And with central bank targeting inflation, we've talked about potential growth prospects in Russia. Rising inflation is not great.
And that's a perennial problem that this country has had over the last, it's the early 2000s.
I mean, fundamentally, I think that ruble weakness is not great for Russia, not just near term, but longer term as well, because the ultimate issue for Russia is the need for trust. trust on the part of the population, on the part of the economic agents, banks, in the ruble, in Russia's assets. And that sizable depreciation is, of course, a bit of a blow to the ruble in that regard. And I think short term, of course, in terms of consumption, this weakness in the ruble is a negative factor. So I think certainly this is a key risk factor for us this year. And a lot, again, depends on this U.S. tapering issue, how it will progress and how emerging markets will react.
Let's talk about capital outflows. It continues to increase. I mean, it was a bad month in December. January was even a little bit worse here. What's driving the capital outflows right now?
You know, I think it is the same phenomena that's been driving it for years, which is, I think, a lack of trust in keeping assets in this country, and also a lack of investment inflows. I mean, we just don't have as much coming in as we should have, I would say. So I think it's the combination of those two things. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, most Russians that I know want to have assets outside of Russia. So this is a fundamental, I think, culture that needs to shift. That plus attracting institutional investors to come in, only then can you have a balance.
What kind of trigger does Russia need to have the capital flows coming into the country?
Well, I mean, I'll just comment on the outflows before I mention that. I mean, we have to remember that a lot of the outflows are actually Russian companies investing overseas. So the headline number is nightmarishly bad, but does include this very positive number that should give Russia major benefit in the future.
It's true. I mean, this is the number itself is an exaggeration because this is Russian money. Okay, it's just being parked someplace else.
Exactly, and actually, if you look at the scale of these outward investments by Russian corporates, a lot of them blessed by the Kremlin, coordinated with the Kremlin abroad and into Europe, into the United States. I mean, the scale is quite significant and is a significant part of the overall outflow. The other issue is that a lot of this investment is very inefficient, so there's a lot of work that needs to be done by the government in coordination with the corporate sector to try and make sure that going forward state companies are far more efficient in terms of how they approach these outward flows. And another issue is, of course, the offshorization that was very prominent last year and probably will continue to be a significant issue during Russia's presidency in the G8. That's something that is going to be a major topic there. And of course, the issue for Russia is not just to make sure that there are no loopholes with regard to offshores, but also there are some carrots, there are some factors that lure, investment.
Well,
back
it's about time, isn't it?
I think offshore financial centers has now become a global issue. And I think the last G8 session really escalated this. I can tell you within the World Bank right now, we look at this very, very carefully. And anybody that doesn't pass the Global Alliance test in terms of an offshore financial center, we will not invest there. And there are going to be more and more investors that do this. So I agree. I think that this problem absolutely needs to be resolved. And I think we're making good progress.
I mean, I'm going to join the consensus. We've got all three of us now complete agreement. The offshore centre as an idea is just slowly dying. You know, it's something that will slowly whittle away.
Okay, let's talk about this quarter and moving forward. What kind of external things should the Russian economy be looking at? Because if I remember correctly, about a year ago, we still were very bullish on the emerging markets, and then developed markets, there was a cloud over them. It seems like it's reversed right now.
Yeah, I think one issue is certainly the U.S. tapering. That's going to be probably the key issue for the year as a whole for emerging markets overall. The other concern is that not only are there signs of weakness in emerging markets, but renewed signs of weakness in the developed world. So the question is it really proper for the developed world to start thinking so aggressively about tapering the stimulus? And then, of course, within the emerging markets world, there's the issue of Ukraine, there's the issue of China posting relatively weak figures. So there's still a significant range of risks, downside risks, for the global economy this year.
Downside risks.
Well, I agree. I would just maybe focus on Europe for a little bit, because it was never, in the last 5 years, really an engine of growth for Russia. Now we're starting to see a soft reform. I don't know how much sort of energy it is behind it. I don't know if it's going to last, but it's very important to Russia in terms of trade. I mean, it's just fundamental.
And it's also the largest investor as well.
Exactly.
Russia, right?
So I think if we see continued improvements in the overall economic situation in Europe, this is the biggest potential plus for Russia. The second thing, which I think is more of a risk in the medium term, is China, because it's really the elephant in the room, I would say. And China, I think, is going to have a pause in terms of growth in the next sort of 6 to 9 months, simply because I think at the municipal level and somewhat at the national level, the country is overextended. And so it needs to deleverage itself a little bit, and I think that this is going to have not such a positive effect on the prices of commodities and oil and gas, which is, of course, key to Russia's economy.
Tell me,
Yeah, the shadow banking in China is really the problem. The official banking sector is enormous. The shadow banking sector, where obviously depositors have gone to try and get over and above the official yield, is beyond extended. We're starting to see a large number of defaults with companies that are borrowed from that sector. It's an issue that needs to be addressed. The Chinese know this. I mean, they're fully aware of it. But it is a major problem to the world economy. I will agree that Europe, I think, is the flat earthers there seem to have got something right. As
for the time being.
For the time being.
Yeah.
Well, they've benefited from the rest of the world growing, and they're just being refloated naturally. But yeah, I think that will significantly benefit Russia. Probably a negative for Russia is the warming Iran-US relations and what that potentially does to oil price. That's for me. That's a little concern for looking forward to Russia.
So far, the oil price has been quite high and comfortable. Yeah, and
quite stable, actually.
Quite stable. It's one of the amazing things about the past several months.
Okay, so it's worry about Iranian oil, worry about Libyan oil. I think there's always going to be strong demand here. Come on, I want to change the subject a little bit. Talk to our viewers here. How does the Russian consumer feel right now, and what is the Russian consumer thinking about?
Well, I think the Russian consumer is more insecure than, say, last year or the past several years because of the ruble dynamics. Certainly, the ruble depreciation is a significant blow. And related to that, of course, is ruble depreciation leading to potentially higher inflation. The other factor is the slowdown in consumer lending. That's something that is actually seen by the central bank as a good thing. But on the other hand, in terms of headline growth figures, this is a bit of a negative. So it's basically a transition, I think, for the economy, but also for the Russian consumer from quantity to quality. And to some degree, because of that, we'll see
I see that's a dynamic here in this market here, is that the patterns are changing. People want better quality, but maybe fewer goods, Tim?
I was just going to say, I think that the average consumer is becoming more sophisticated in many ways in terms of the quality of the products that they choose, but also looking from the banking side, also in the price of the credit that they take. So this is a process. Banking is very new in this country, and people are just getting used to the idea of understanding, gee, if I pay this percent and I pay this fee, that's a lot, and I'm not going to do that. So I think this is a good thing, but consumer credit is still growing. It will probably grow 25% per year this year. And so it's not shrinking. So I think what consumers are doing is using their rubles and their credit more judiciously. They're not buying big things like cars and that. They're focused on things that make a difference in their day-to-day life.
20 seconds.
The consumer is actually slowing down quite significantly. Retail sales across Russia were necessarily down year on year. This is a worry looking forward, as we've all talked about, the consumer being part of the growth.
Okay, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests and thanks to our viewers for watching us here on The Money. See you next time and stay with RT.